Okay, I just want to, oh, yes, it is on. So, hello, everyone. Unfortunately, Professor No Jin-kwak, who is the current director for the Center of Korean Studies, is unable to make it today. So in his stead, I would like to welcome you to a very special lecture that is part of the Center's Distinguished Korean Studies Scholar Series. I'm Monica Kim, and I'm currently a PhD student in the Department of History and also a longtime member of this Korean Center Studies community. I have the distinct honor today to introduce a very special event, a very special conversation, really, that the Center for Korean Studies has both supported and facilitated. Today's conversation on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is both timely and significant at this political moment in Korea. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Korea was established on May 9th, 2005 under a legislative bill titled the Framework Act on Clearing Up Past Incidents for Truth and Reconciliation. This bill passed actually by a very small margin in the National Assembly under fierce opposition from the Uri Party. At this moment, the future of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is uncertain under the current newly elected President Lee Myung-bak and his administration. The mandate that had created the commission was due to expire in April 2010 with the option of a 2-year extension. However, now, instead of a 2-year extension, there is now a 2-month extension. The future of the commission and also the larger question of who will write the final report is currently at the heart of much of the current debates over the commission in Korea. Although Professor Kwak is not here with us right now, I would like to thank him and the Center for immediately understanding the timeliness and significance of inviting Professor Dong-Choon Kim, the former commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to the University of Michigan. In fact, the organization that I work with, the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea, would not have been able to put together what has become a 7-university lecture series and tour from Johns Hopkins to University of Toronto to UC San Diego without this very crucial funding and support from the center. So I thank both Professor Kwak and Ms. Jeong Lee for their truly exceptional commitment and excitement in bringing this event together. Now, I like to think of this event at University of Michigan to be the highlight of Professor Kim's 7-university tour. And it's not just because I believe that our center is so special. It's also because of the particular dialogue that we will have the privilege today of hearing. Although Professor Kim and Professor David Lloyd may seem to be coming here today from rather disparate areas, both geographically and academically, both scholars, from Irish studies or from Korean studies, from sociology or literature. In the work of both scholars, a central question resonates throughout. The question of how we conceptualize multiple pasts in our present and its subsequent impact on the contours of our imaginings of the future. In 2009, I worked with Professor Kim on the English translation of a seminal work of his, a book titled War and Society, or now the English title, The Unending Korean War. This book is a social history of the war, one that began with core issues of the wartime experience that had not, rather surprisingly, been ever on the horizon of academic debates over the war. One of those issues was civilian massacres, especially those that had been committed by South Korean, not North Korean, military or police forces. The book had been published in Korea back in the year 2000, and the oral history interviews he had conducted for the book eventually found him organizing on the behalf of the bereaved families of the victims. And I believe that we can say that his organizing and his scholarship led him to his later work as commissioner on the TRC. One aspect of Professor Kim's approach to thinking critically about the civilian massacres in his book that struck me as very significant was his insistence upon considering, quote, the undeniable experiences and the unimaginable pain that people had kept bitterly locked within their bodies as a type of subjugated knowledge, to borrow the phrase from Foucault. The experience and the pain were knowledges that extended from the colonial period and subsequently exceeded the temporal frame of the war, while also challenging the present legitimacy of the state-building project. We talk together often about the possible appropriate English words to express such an approach, to think about the past as, quote, traces in our present, for example. And the stakes for refusing a linear separation between the past and the present are high. To quote from Professor Kim, "Without examining South Korea's suppressed memories, there can be no true communication, social solidarity, political participation, or sense of community in Korea." That the past is another country is a dictum also challenged by Professor David Lloyd. Professor Lloyd has written on a wide-ranging issues, but today I'm just going to focus on one particular work that was published recently, where he rethinks the temporal frames of modernity and colonialism, here specifically British colonialism, via the simultaneous representings and forgettings of the Irish famine during the commemorations of the famine in the 1990s. In this work, Professor Lloyd very movingly insists that the very logics that rendered the Irish famine as an event that exceeds the capacity for representation and memory within the frames of modernization are also the very same logics that demarcate the limit or threshold in the conception of the human. In a phrase perhaps quite resonant with Professor Kim's traces, Professor Lloyd talks about the, quote, phenomenon of haunting, and there's one particular type of specter I would like to bring in this room and discussion, and here I'm going to quote quite extensively. "One haunting is the more familiar ghost that rises from destruction itself and which seeks redress for the injustice of its negation. What complicates this haunting, however, is that the specter that returns is not simply that of the myriad unburied dead of the famine, but the haunting resonance of the victim's dehumanization this side of death, the dehumanization that made their extirpation thinkable and admissible. It is a specter that continues to haunt because we are not yet free, collectively, of the shadows of processes of dehumanization that have their counterparts all too evidently in our own time." In a recent interview with the Korean progressive newspaper, the Hangbyore, Professor Kim talked about his own experiences working with the TRC. He said, "I must have read the statements and testimonies of at least 10,000 different people, which included the testimonies of both victims and perpetrators. In Korea, I may be the person who has read the largest number of testimonies." So in the face of 10,000 testimonies, what can this question about hauntings, traces, and specters do for us? It is perhaps an opportunity for a pause, a reflection on our present moment. Both Professor Kim and Professor Lloyd have insisted upon the imagining of alternatives for the future through a reconfiguration of how the past inhabits the present. There is a history also to the demands of Koreans that have been placed on the state for an organizational, institutional process of dealing with past injustice. The first moment was in 1945, after liberation from Japanese colonial rule. The second moment was in 1960, with the end of Syngman Rhee's rule. And the third was in 1987, with the demise of Jeon Do-hwan's military regime. Today, I hope that through Professor Kim's talk and Professor Lloyd's response, we will be able to reflect on what kinds of demands we can make in this particular moment. It is also very significant that Professor Kim and Professor Lloyd are having this conversation here at University of Michigan. Professor Kim was here at University of Michigan in 2003 as a visiting scholar, and his time here resulted in a book titled America's Engine, War and the Marketplace, based on his observations as a sociologist who had studied the Korean War and was now in front of the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I believe that Professor Kim and Professor Lloyd, both intellectuals who have spoken critical interventions in the projects of the U.S. globally, are just the people to help us frame our current moment in front of the past and the future. Please help me welcome Professor Dong-Choon Kim and Professor David Lloyd.
Thank you. My name is Dong-Choon Kim from Korea, Seoul University. I am a sociology professor of Seoul University. As Monica introduced you, I spent one year as a visiting scholar, 2003. I'm happy to be here with you to have a talk. It's great honor for me and great pleasure for me to introduce you about my experience in Korea's Truth Commission for last 4 years. And I also, originally I was just academia, writing about the Korean War and Korea's working class formation. But after 2000, after finishing my work about Korean War, just victims' family members and Korean society asked me and my colleagues to resolve the pent-up grievances of the victims, Korean War victims. So I have been active to organize the victims' family members and my colleagues to make this hidden history known to Korean public. So I was active for last about 5 or 6 years, including my stay in University of Michigan. Then I was active in building Truth Commission in Korea, especially in 2003-4, the liberal Nomi elected president in Korea, and the liberal Uri party, the current Democratic Party, current opposition party, became the majority party in 2004's general election. So these favorable political circumstances made it possible to this kind of Truth Commission could be established in Korea. So today I have so many topics to introduce you, but as time is limited, I just jump one topic another. But today's topic, I like to say maybe divided three. One is the brief history of modern Korea, just related to past wrongdoings. And second, the history of past stealing, how Koreans faced the past misdeed, and what kinds of organizations, institutions we built in Korea. And third, finally, just I like to introduce you the controversial point we faced in Truth Commission. As I'm a government official, as a quite high-ranked government official in Korea, Deputy Prime Minister, is the Truth Commission standing commissioner. So, just I like to speak about just brief modern history that related to past wrongdoings. You know, when we look at the world history, there were two moments in terms of past stealing. One, the after World War II period, it's just a transitional period. And second, the post-authoritarian regime period, or post-Cold War period. And in case of first one, you may know the Nuremberg trial and Tokyo trial is the most important cases. In terms of second period, second moments, you remember the truth commissions in South Africa and Latin America and other countries in the world. But in case of Korea, we also experienced these two transitional periods. But the short moments in 1960s, just after the Seungman Lee's demise. But broadly speaking, we can say in Korea we experienced two important periods of in terms of past steering. But the first period, the first transitional period, Koreans faced a problem of punishing the Japanese collaborators who served the Japanese colonialism. Japanese fascist rule, a kind of anti-nation law was passed in 1949. But you know, the Cold War, global Cold War, dominated in South Korea, and so the President Lee Seung-man demolished that kinds of organization because Lee Seung-man used those Japanese collaborators to try to keep his system and his rightist system in Korea. Then the first failure brought another past wrongs, and the failure of second stage also brought second, third misdeeds in Korea. The failure of punishing the Japanese collaborators after the World War II in the liberation period in Korea brought Korean War massacres, civil war. Then and brought just mass killings in 1960s when students protest Lee Seung-man government. Lee Seung-man government killed about 200 students. Then there were a kinds of past stealing process, just the demise of Lee Seung-man regime. But we also had two short transitional period. Park Chung-hee seized the power in 1961. Then these two failures brought another human rights abuses since 1961. And from 1961 until 1987, there happened human rights abuses and disappearance cases and fabricate spy incident in Korea. So we also tried several institutions or organs or movements to overcome the past from 1945 until 1987. But the Cold War regime, anti-communism in Korea, and the national security law forbid that kinds of activities in Korea. So the past stealing process just began in 1987 when Chun Doo-hwan regime collapsed. But when Chun Doo-hwan regime collapsed in 1987, the long pent-up grievances and accumulated past misdeeds, past problems occurred one by one, unanimously from 83, 87. And so just the most important cases after the democratization movement, democracy movement in 1987 was the Gongju problem. Just the most relatively recent problem, the vivid experience for ordinary Koreans. So Gongju hearing occurred in 1988, and the special committee was established to punish the former president Chun Doo-hwan, Roh Tae-woo, who were allegedly involved in Gongju massacre. So in 1990s, in Korea, like the other cases in Latin America, we also experienced several kinds of past dealing movement and activities and governmental organization in 1990s, from Gongju problems to the Presidential Commission for investigating suspicious deaths, 의문사위원회, suspicious, that was established in 2000 and finished its mission in 2004. And okay, among these various past dealing institutions, the final or the comprehensive form would be the Truth Commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that I'd like to introduce you today. So then, as a commissioner of this commission, we have 4 full-time standing commissioner in this commission, and I was in charge of especially Korean War massacres. So I directed the investigating the incident that we received from the victims' families, petitions from the victims' families. So I directed and presided over these incidents for last 4 years. So I can't introduce every human rights abuses case or past cases, but today I'm going to introduce briefly about my job as the Korean War massacres by showing you some photos how the massacre was like. Korean War massacre occurred from 1948 until 1953. And before the Korean War, there occurred the Jeju April 3rd incident and Yosun incident. Those incidents originally occurred by the leftist activists opposed to the general election in Korea that was scheduled to divide North and South Korea. And not just leftist, but the nationalists opposed Lee government. But Lee government, the military and police, may be sponsored by U.S. forces who advised South Korea, or in some sense commanded South Korean forces, suppressed the incident. Throughout the suppression policy, so many innocent civilians also were killed. And Yosun incident occurred just the same time in dispatching the Korean troops to Jeju Island. The Korean troops refused to went to Jeju. So about 10 days they occupied Yosu, Suncheon areas. Then South Korean military and police, also sponsored by U.S. forces, suppressed the leftist rebellion. Then throughout the suppression policy, those civilians who were believed to collaborate with the rebellious forces also killed. I can show you the photo taken at Yosu. The gathered person, maybe you can see Korean soldier maybe searching for collaborators, I think. Also, this photo was taken at Yosu. One guy appealed to the police, I'm innocent, I didn't collaborate the leftist. And the men are waiting for screening or investigating whether they collaborated the leftist. Most of them were killed without trial. And this photo shows the the corps of the police, also rebellious forces killed the police. So at that time, the left-wingers couldn't take this kind of photo. Also, the photo shows the death of the police. Mutual killings time. Okay, Korean National Police. The leaders of National Police were trained under the Japanese colonial rule. They were notorious in torturing and treating harshly against Korean citizens. That kind of tradition still, in some sense, persists until recently. I can divide the massacres during the Korean War for several types, according to the perpetrator or according to the identification of the victims. One, maybe the most popular and widespread and nationwide cases were the killings against the National Guidance League members. We call 국민보도연맹. National Guidance League, the same name we can find under Japanese colonial rule. Japanese colonialism also used these kinds of organization, those who converted communists, to gather in one organization and monitor every day, and they call and suspect their activities every day. And Lee government also organized this kind of organization in 1949. When war broke out, North Korea invaded South Korea. Lee government was afraid of those people collaborate North Korea, then killed. And second type of massacre occurred, just 38th parallel. North Korean army invaded South Korea. In 3 days, Seoul areas was occupied by North Korean forces immediately. And North Korean forces moved south rapidly. Then just a small part of South Korea, number 1 area, remained. And then MacArthur landed Incheon, just cut the line. And the North Korean military moved north, but MacArthur cut the line. So the guerrilla forces and local leftists were active in number 4 areas, in Jirisan areas. So South Korean military used the suppression policy against civilians, those who were believed to collaborate leftist guerrillas in number 4 areas. And North Korean army, North Korean police, or local leftists also killed many innocent civilians, those rightist family members, before moving north. And finally, killings by U.S. forces. Just U.S. forces intervened in the Korean War. Then they were unprepared, and they knew nothing about Koreans, and they couldn't understand why Koreans were fighting against each other, and they couldn't discriminate civilians from North Korean armies. So they bombed refugees and strafed against civilians. You may know Nogunri incident. Nogunri incident, one of the isolated incidents among numerous U.S.-related victimization cases. Yes, so 1, 2, 3, 4 categories. Number one, only National Guidance League members were killed areas. Number two, the National Guidance League members were alive because North Korea moved suddenly. And when South Korea occupied Seoul again, they followed North Korean forces, moved north, some of them. But some of them were killed, and some of them were alive. Most famous Korean writer, you may know, Koreans may know Hwang Sun-won, or you may know the poet Jung Ji-young was also the member of National Guidance League. And so number three, is the most of Korean Peninsula occurred these kind of massacres across the country. And number four, the scorched earth policy was used to suppress those civilians who lived nearby guerrilla forces. Just I show you some photo. This photo very unique and rare picture taken by English journalist, picture post. You can see just before execution, the political prisoners moving killing field located nearby Gongju. Last year we exhumed the bones. I can show you the photo. Right. Then similar kinds of photo you can see nearby Daegu. We don't know the exact place, but you can discriminate the civilians. You can see the clothes just before killings. Those who were killed and shot Korean military police, National Guidance League members. And Dajon, we guess more than 3,000 civilians, political prisoners, were killed nearby Dajon. Some of them were just killed, and some of them before killing, just before killing. You can see this photo was taken by U.S. forces, just released during the Clinton era. In maybe 2001, I remember just the relatively liberal government in America released this photo. One boy is waiting for execution in Pusan prison. Also forced to move to killing field, the political prisoners in Pusan. The screening process, who may be killed or who may be alive. Some of them killed without trial, but some of them were killed by just a summary execution and without trial. And this photo shows the Incheon, just after the MacArthur's Incheon landing. Incheon landing, the Korean military searched for communist or communist collaborators. Even small boy raised his hand. This photo showed the rightist family members who were killed by North Korean military or local leftist. Gongju prison, I think. We can see this kind of photo was taken by U.S. forces War Crime Department. Many photos we can see by U.S. forces. U.S. bombed 월미도. 월미도 is just in front of Incheon. Before landing Incheon, MacArthur's Air Force strafed and bombed and intensive bombing. In some sense, scorched earth policy against 월미도. The North Korean army also stationed in 월미도. But at 월미도, about 500 civilians were alive, was living in 월미도. And we don't know how many among them were killed, but our commission investigated that incident last year. So you can see how the mass bombing, intensive bombing was like at 월미도. In 1960, when 이승만 government collapsed, the bereaved family members rose up and they organized themselves, bereaved families, national organization of bereaved families, and they asked for punishing those who killed their fathers, mothers, grandfathers, mothers. And the typical Korean memorial service, the victims' families gathered to memorize those who were killed by South Korean military and police. Then the Korean National Assembly surprised this movement, and the Korean National Assembly reacted to suddenly organized special investigation team. But they just investigated only 7 days across the Korean peninsula. Then Park Chung-hee waged a military coup. Everything was gone, and nothing could be established after Park Chung-hee's military coup. The same photo you can see at Gimhae, Gyeongsang areas. Now we are going to the activities of the Truth Commission. As Monica introduced you, the Truth Commission in Korea established 2005, and the work of Commission launched in December 2005. Our commission was the result of the long struggles of past dealing process in Korea, and maybe the final or comprehensive form of past dealing. We comprise just two streams of past misdeed in Korea. One, I introduce you Korean War massacres things. Second, human rights abuses cases. And politically mysterious death or fabricated cases under Park Chung-hee government and Chun Doo-hwan government. And suspicious death cases under Chun Doo-hwan regime, early 1980s. But Gongju problem we didn't deal with because Gongju problem was dealt with another commissions. And the Framework Act, the base of our commission, wrote the scope of our commission, these two past incidents. But at that time, opposition party, current ruling party, Grand National Party, strongly opposed to build this organization. And why? I jumped. Why past dealing is necessary, and why you are going to look back. We are tired of these kind of activities. We have so many past dealing incidents in Korea since 1983. No more past dealing institution in Korea. They strongly opposed to pass the bill. But at the time, Uri party, it was a ruling party. So there was a political compromise between ruling party and opposition party. So opposition party, Grand National Party, insisted on inserting other incidents to investigate. For example, you are so focusing on the dark side of Korean society. So we must focusing on the bright side of Korean society, bright history, and our achievement must be emphasized. So, okay, they insist on inserting national independence movement. And second, the achievement of overseas Koreans. Okay, very good achievement for Koreans. Third, massacres by North Korean forces and human rights abuses by leftists. So these three areas were inserted in the scope of our commission's investigation field. So, okay, so there was inevitable to accept the request of the conservative parties. So our commission may be the result of political compromise at the time in Korean politics. So we had a kind of controversy among civic groups, among intellectuals who were interested in past dealing. You know, we look at in the world two kinds of past dealing process would be optional. One, justice by court, punishing the perpetrators and compensating the victims. And second type became more popular in third world countries, in South Africa and Latin American countries, is justice by truth commission, without punishing the perpetrators, building truth in exchange of punishing the perpetrators who confess their misdeed. So we opted the second type of past dealing among Korean civic groups and scholars, including me, from 1990s and early 2000s. And so we have some controversy over how to name or conceptualize these kind of activities. In Korean, it's very difficult to translate to English. We usually call 과거 청산. 청산 means cleanse, or you can figure out move all, pay back. This concept inherited from 1945. We cleanse Japanese collaborators, remove all the components or institutions, laws, and figures, those who betray the nation. So we usually use the concept of 청산. But originally in our bill, the name of our bill was 청산. But also opposition party opposed to use that kind of concept. They proposed settlement, 정리. Settlement is more moderate than cleanse. So it's very difficult to translate English. Every time I say I'm confusing and perplexing how to conceptualize this process in Korea. But eventually we used settlement in our law. And yes, I introduced the scope of our investigation. Yes, I introduce you the character of organizations of Truth Commission. Truth Commission is different from ordinary governmental organization. You know, commission is composed of commissioners, and the final decision is made by commissioners' discussion. And if we couldn't reach a decision by vote, and so commission is very specific organization to deal with this kind of incident. And the second, the status of this organization. We emphasize the independence from other government organizations' interference, but we got our fund from Korean government. But the investigation and truth-finding process must be independent without interfering other pressure from other organizations in Korea, like military and police and KCIA and other from other organizations. And chairperson and standing commissioner, two standing commissioner, two non-standing commissioner were appointed by the president. Former president and I were appointed by former President Roh Moo-hyun. And the status and was decided as a level of ministry. And then there was some controversy over commissioners' qualifications and terms, and so I'm going to skip this topic. And most hottest issue before setting up our commission was the authority and mandate of the commission. Can we recall the perpetrators or potential offenders to our commission was the hottest issue at the time, and how to define the illegal victimization. Can we call U.S. bombing against civilians were illegal or not? It's very sensitive questions for us to decide. And authority to submit materials related to matters subject to investigation, like military and police, if they refuse to submit sensitive documents to our commission, we couldn't investigate. And those who were believed to be offenders or perpetrators refused to appear to our commission. How can we verify the truth? So you can see the articles of our law in our website. I can say the address of website if you need it. I jumped. So finally, how can we confirm the petitions, whether the argument of the petitions were right or must be dismissed or unverifiable or verifiable? This process was the daily activities of our commission. The 75% of the petitions are related to Korean War massacre cases in our commission. And human rights abuses case is very separate one, so the number is small. But in case of massacre things, we merge several petitions into one. This is the list, the data before my departure of commission last November. About 72% we finished. Okay. Also, we exhumed the site in some places in Korea. I can show you some photos that we discovered on the yes, you may remember the Dajon Massacres. Dajon areas we exhumed several bones preserved today. Also, we exhumed you may remember number 4 areas, Jirisan suppression policy, those who were killed at that place, about 400 bones we exhumed. We guess about more than 100 sites are still preserved, but it's very difficult to identify one specific point here because the scene was quite greatly transformed and changed, so nobody saw the specific point where the mass killing occurred. Also, that was exhumed at Dajon. So finally, I'm going to say the confirmation process. We have 2 sources, one written document and one statement. Statement from victims and statement from reference people from potential or perpetrators. The written documents, it's very hard to find the written document. You may know the perpetrators don't remain any written documents about their misdeed. But fortunately, we find some documents. Those were written after the massacres by Korean police in order to surveillance the remaining family members who were killed, and the Korean government used these documents in order to execute guilt by association. Those whose father, mother were killed during the Korean War couldn't become a government official, high-ranked government official, and couldn't enter military academy and so on. Yes, you can see the list of collaborators made 1962 in one county, Ul진, in Gyeongsang-Bukdo. Under this list, you can see those who were killed. The identification card, National Guidance League members. And CIC related document. You may know CIC was the Counterintelligence Corps. It's the highly secret organization in military. Originally established in U.S. military and in England and United States for intelligence army. And U.S. forces trained South Korean military. More intelligent people became CIC members. The CIC might ordered mass killings. I don't know who ordered CIC head, the head of CIC, but CIC was responsible for the massacres during the Korean War. Still, this organization is still working in Korean military, Kimusa, we called. also surveillance list, the similar kinds of list that was used to surveillance and monitoring those family members of those killed. The similar. So after confirming the incident, our commission supported the memorial service. This is an official memorial service. After official report by our government, I attended the memorial service as a representative of Truth Commission. And this memorial service show the offenders at the time, the organization, the chief of organization in a county attended the meeting. You can see the police chief and I and governor and lawmaker and commander of I don't know, but one division of the military in Hanpyeong areas. Okay, I'm sorry, my speech is too long for you and too various topics. I'm going to speak the experience of Korea and experience of Truth Commission in Korea would be a very important, valuable thing, not just for Korea's history, for the future of Korea, but East Asian politics to eternal peace, to make eternal peace and reconciliation, not just among Koreans, but Japan and Korea. China and Japan is the first step, maybe to be a reconciliation among East Asian people, and for the peace of East Asia, we must work further in order to making human rights and peace. The experiment of our commission would be very important to and in just educating for next generation and revising the history and kinds of refreshing the misdeed of the past. Thank you very much.
I want to just start by thanking Monica for her kind invitation to be here today, and of course for your very kind introduction of us both, and to thank the Center for Korean Studies here at for hosting this occasion, which I agree is one of enormous importance, both in the sense of the significance of any Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and, as Monica has been saying, the importance of this particular moment and the future of the TRC in Korea, which, as Professor Kim has been saying, is also about the future of truth and reconciliation beyond Korea itself. And I want to thank you, Professor Kim, for what you have spoken about today and the images that you have shown us, all of which are profoundly painful to see and to hear about, and yet, as I'll be talking more about, profoundly important for us to confront as both ethical and political issues. I hasten to say that I stand here not as someone who knows very much at all about Korea. I grew up knowing a little about the Korean War and, coming from a small country on the periphery of a continent not unlike Korea. Perhaps there may be some sympathies. People tell me that Korea is the Ireland of Asia or Ireland the Korea of Europe, depending on which way around you want us to talk about it. But I think it's important for those of us who come from small countries with colonial pasts that have suffered in various ways from atrocities, massacres, famines, genocides, and most recently perhaps counterinsurgencies, to exchange and share about our experience and about this very fundamental problem which arises every time we discuss reparations, redress, and even reconciliation in relation to the question of the truth about the past. How do we rectify the historical record and make space for memory, which is not always the same thing as the written historical record? How do we begin to take memory seriously when, as you say, memory is often the only place in which the traces of a past that has been suppressed or occluded continue to survive? There's another pair of related questions to this, the first being simply, how do we do justice to the dead? How do we do justice to those who are not with us to confront, to apologize, to recompense in any way? And that's not, it seems to me, a trivial question at all. How we actually think about doing justice not only to the living and to the surviving, but also to the dead, those whom history has in a sense erased. How do we bring them back and confront them? And a related question to that is, how do we achieve reconciliation? What does it mean to reconcile, not simply to reconcile the victim with the perpetrator, but to reconcile ourselves to the violence that is the common element of all too many of our pasts? In Ireland, there has been no Truth and Reconciliation Commission, though many have asked for it, and I'm talking about the immediate past of Northern Ireland, where there were many victims both of the state and, of course, of various paramilitary groups. It has been asked that there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission so that that past can be confronted directly, but actually it is the government that has denied the possibility of proposing and fulfilling a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It seems to me that the state as an institution raises real problems. In our own case in Ireland, one of the reasons that the British government will not countenance a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is because it poses itself as not having been an actor in the violence, but an arbiter of violence between conflicting parties. The state understands itself then not to be an agent of violence, but as an institution that comes to cure violence and to have, if you like, a therapeutic role. Wherever it is confronted with its own role in violence, it tends to shy away from such things as rectification, truth, history, and so forth. As we all know, the definition of the state has been put quite succinctly by the German sociologist Max Weber. The state is that institution which claims the monopoly of legitimate violence in a given territory. As Walter Benjamin, the German social critic, points out, it's not simply that the state controls who is allowed and not allowed to use violence, it's that violence is foundational to the state itself. States come into being more often than not through violence, but also they maintain their legal authority through the exercise of violence. In a certain sense, the right to inflict the death penalty is the ultimate legitimating sanction of the state itself. Secondly, as so many of Professor Kim's works that I've been reading lately point out, the state not only controls and demands the legitimacy of the use of violence for itself, and the monopoly of that use of violence, it also claims, in a certain respect, the monopoly on history, the monopoly on the tale that is to be told to the people as to what their past actually is constituted of. The monopoly of narrative, as theorists like Antonio Gramsci in Italy have told us over and over again, the monopoly on narrative is almost as important a fact in the maintenance of power and domination as is the monopoly over violence. If people do not know their history, they do not know that there were other possibilities. They do not know that there were other paths that might have been taken. And thirdly, part of what keeps the state in place, in a sense, is its denial of the idea that it is an institution which is founded in violence and which is often maintained by violence. The state's idea of itself in modernity is that the state comes to cure violence that comes from elsewhere. I think of this very forcefully in the case of British rule in Ireland, where the British tended to always characterize the Irish as the source of misrule, unruliness, violence, unrest, and so forth, whereas the modern state came to cure the Irish of their incivility and to raise them into proper civilized beings. This is, however, I think, a general idea of the state. The state is the disinterested body that leads us to reconciliation, that suppresses violence and therapeutically clears the society of violence that comes from elsewhere. I was very struck in Professor Kim's writings by the way in which the Korean War itself was represented as, first of all, a police action, an action to get rid of a criminal element as opposed to an actual war between nations. And that the imagery that was used of insurgency was the imagery of disease, a viral infection that had to be cleansed. And I'm very struck by the way the notion of cleansing hovered over the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself, that might have been a possibility of thinking of truth and reconciliation as yet another form of cleansing or purging of a disease, rather than actually an engagement with and a working through of the past. The state, in other words, cannot easily admit to its co-implication in violence. In our own case in Northern Ireland, the major problem was that counterinsurgency discourse, that whole apparatus of legal and journalistic and often historical interventions that sought to legitimate the British government's campaign of counterinsurgency in a country that had been set up and established on the basis of a profound injustice and inequity, was actually always represented as the end of a state to cure that violence that came through conflicts that were located among the Irish and not in a conflict that went on between the Irish and the British. There are a number of incidents, of course, that needed to have the truth unfolded in order that they could be put behind us and people could be, in a sense, healed from the kinds of violence that they'd suffered. Perhaps the most famous one is the incident of Bloody Sunday. It pales in comparison with what has happened in Korea, but 13 civilians who were on a civil rights demonstration, a non-violent civil rights demonstration, were shot down by the British Marines, equivalent to the British of the American Marines, the paratroopers, and were shot down in cold blood. And to this date, in fact, the Commission has not actually brought forward who the perpetrators were, who the commanding officers were, who gave the order to fire with live ammunition on a crowd of non-violent demonstrators. These situations that emerge from counterinsurgency operations should, I think, be a very strong reminder to us that counterinsurgency, which really emerges as a practice of policing and suppression of dissidents in the immediate post-war period, has become increasingly generalized. As you know, the United States at this very moment is involved in two counterinsurgency campaigns that I believe Professor Kim, I didn't know this, but Professor Kim has written about, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those counterinsurgency campaigns are producing massacres, war crimes, rapes. We know this from the very few reports that have managed to filter out of both locations. They are leading to the bombings of Afghan villages and the destruction of Iraqi towns. And these questions are in fact continuous, as we know, with the ways in which the American military gave advice and counsel to the Korean army in some of these atrocities that Professor Kim has been uncovering. There is, in other words, a continuing worldwide process of containment that is going on at this very moment that is not something that we can separate from the history of places like Korea. It is, in fact, a generalized and continuous activity. It was, of course, advisors from the United States who assisted both the Chilean and the Argentinian government in Latin America and the Guatemalan and Honduran governments in Central America. The same people, the same units that were advising one set of police, army, and so forth, and encouraging them to commit atrocities, to perpetrate torture, and so forth, were also circulating in other parts where the United States was involved. In the same way, the techniques of torture that were used in Irish prison camps gave rise to sensory deprivation techniques that are being applied not only in Guantanamo, Bagram, and so forth, but also applied in Israeli prisons against Palestinians. There is, in other words, a global network of counterinsurgency practices that are part and parcel of what will be a future need for truth and reconciliation commissions to take place and to investigate. We are, in other words, not able to separate ourselves from the past that has just been unfolded to us in the context of Korea. Counterinsurgency takes place, of course, against the threat of insurgent violence that is usually caricatured as atavistic, as backward, as terroristic, and so forth. But that counterinsurgency violence, in its own way, makes claims that in Ireland gradually became to be known as counter-legal claims. That is, it was at first thought that agrarian violence, for example, in early 19th century Ireland, was merely unrest, unruliness, the incapacity of the Irish to accept civilized norms of legal behavior and so forth. But it gradually became apparent to British observers that what it actually represented were forms of counter-legality. In other words, claims laid to another set of moral and legal ideas about what social relations should look like. These agrarian revolts represented, as so many social struggles do, alternatives to a very restricted idea of the state form, a state form that Irish people found hard to accept and hard to actually adopt within their own country. That struggle, in a sense, against a particular kind of state form continues to this very day as people try to figure out other modes of living and other forms of organizing social relations. This leads us to the question, then, that I started with, was in what form can reconciliation take place? I think, first of all, that reconciliation is something that depends upon the recognition that truth is multiple. By that, I don't mean that truth is simply relative, that there are all kinds of interpretations of the past and they're all equally valid. Nor do I think that all interpretations of the past are equivalent, that they each exist on the same plane. Rather, I think what I'm suggesting is that as we think about the past and the conflicting claims over the past, we think rather of the truth of the past as being differential. I mean by that there will be one claim about the past. Take, for example, British counterinsurgency histories of Ireland in Northern Ireland over the last 30 years, which have always understood it to be a question of terrorism. These are countered by what I would say is a differential narrative, a narrative that takes its meaning from its difference from that dominant narrative, which claimed that in fact people were looking for an alternative way to live, an alternative set of social relations that would get rid of domination. These alternative memories of the historical past challenge both the state's monopoly on violence and the state's monopoly on history, or on narrative. But they also, I think just as importantly, challenge the state's monopoly on the future. I would want to make a distinction, in other words, between being asked to become reconciled to the violence of the past, to be asked, in other words, to let go of the wounds and injuries that have been done both to individuals and to whole populations, in the name of moving forward. In other words, as we experienced in Ireland under the period of the Celtic Tiger, which has recently ended, R.I.P., in that period of sudden and unexpected prosperity, people were asked to commemorate the famine, but also to let go the past. In a certain sense, to forget the victims of the past, who were condemned by the judgment that modernity was actually Ireland's future, Ireland's proper future and Ireland's only future. The victims of the famine were themselves victims of a process of modernization 150 years earlier, and we were asked in turn to reconcile to their loss, to their deaths, by saying, we too will move on and put the past behind us. That seems to me, in fact, to try to enter injustice into the very heart of one's idea of what the future is, that the future should be a space cleansed of the violence of the past, rather than one that has worked through the violence of the past and insisted that it should not return again. It is, indeed, like the objections to the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself, that we were being asked no longer to deal with the past. Why so much past dealing? Why so much of the backward look that the Irish are all too famous for demonstrating? Theodore Adorno, in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, gives us a very interesting example of what faces people who seek to mourn the past when they are, in fact, being asked to adapt. He speaks, of course, of emigrants as a refugee from Nazi Germany, but I think the same is equally true of all of us who are survivors of colonial pasts or pasts of violence, which means virtually everybody. Adorno writes, The well-meaning, if threatening advice frequently given to emigrants to forget all their past because it cannot be transferred, and to begin a completely new life, simply represents a forcible reminder to the newcomer of something which he has long learnt for himself. History is eliminated in oneself and others out of a fear that it may remind the individual of the degeneration of his own existence, which itself continues. That is why mourning is watered down more than anything else and consciously turned into a social formality. In reality, the dead suffer a fate which the Jews in olden days considered the worst possible curse. They are expunged from the memory of those who live on. It seems to me a very, very powerful paragraph, in that what Adorno recognizes is that the elimination of the past affects not only the past that is eliminated, but the person's relationship both to the present and to the future. Both the present and the future of both individuals and societies become deeply impoverished as we erase the path in what I think Adorno once called reconciliation under duress. In place of such reconciliation under duress, I would want to suggest that the only form of reconciliation that might conceivably be adequate to the violence of the past is one which would imply a redeemed relation of non-domination between subjects and between societies. One that insisted that the condition of reconciliation is not simply forgiveness or forgetfulness, but actually the insistence on non-domination as a practice of society. But it must also be a form of non-domination that does justice to the multiple imaginations of the good life, of life in common, which were represented by those who were put to death in the past. It is not only the memory of the dead in the form of their existence that we seek to preserve, but the memory of their desires, the memory of the possibilities that they embodied and that they wished to live out. The memory of the dead who went down in the Irish famine, 1 million of them or possibly more, is not satisfied by simply knowing that they existed and that they died. It is only satisfied when we begin the project of trying to understand what kind of world they might have wished for. Not the world that in fact emerged precisely because they died. An Ireland more successfully modernized and colonized, and eventually an Ireland of the Celtic Tiger with its prosperity and its deep divisions in the society between the poor and the extremely wealthy. But rather, a society which would have been a projection of their own pleasures and their own joys and their own desires. Only when we begin to recognize that the imagination of what utopia might be for any given people is multiple and diverse and embodied, do we begin to realize that the memory of the past is the memory of possibility, the memory of possibilities of the future that were killed in their own time, and that, in fact, as we know, looking around the world, we desperately need. The dead cannot be given redress or reparation, though the truth and material reparation may aid the survivors and help them therapeutically and in other ways. But the ultimate injustice to the dead is the premature closure of history that consigns not only their existence, but their ways of being and of imagining to oblivion. Let me just end by another little passage, just a sentence from Adorno, from a beautiful little note on ghosts that he wrote in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Only the conscious horror of destruction creates the correct relationship with the dead, the unity with them because we, like them, are the victims of the same condition and the same disappointed hope. Professor Kim, you have confronted us with horror. There is no way to put aside the painfulness of what you showed us. I can only hope that in showing us this, you have brought us to the conscious horror of destruction that Adorno talks about. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Professor David Lloyd so much for his comments, and also Professor Dong-Choon Kim. I know that we are now past 5:30, but I was wondering if anybody would be interested in hearing Professor Kim's response, and I also did want to give some time for question and answer. So would you be interested in having a bit more time in extending this? Okay. Q&A. Well, why don't we give Professor Kim just very, very brief response, perhaps, to Professor David Lloyd's comments, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Okay. So, Professor Kim, maybe just 2 minutes of response.
Yes. Thank you for your comment about, especially about reconciliation, true reconciliation. I didn't mention anything about reconciliation in our commission because as we use the term of reconciliation, in Korean Peninsula, we are technically at war with North Korea. The true reconciliation between among South Koreans has not just begun, I think. The ruling Korean War narratives, as you mentioned, the monopoly of knowledge by the state is very important. But you mentioned no counter narratives against the ruling Korean War narratives has been permitted in Korea. So conflicting narratives must be possible after our commission's work. But knowledge, make knowledge knowledgeable is important step for, I think, the reconciliation. But you know, acknowledge through acknowledgement from the military and police, I don't think they truly acknowledge the report of our report. Just the first step toward the reconciliation, I think, toward through normalization of social relationship between South Korea and in the future between North and South Korea. So very difficult for us to making progress. It's just the first step of investigating the truth, then make the truth knowledgeable to Korean public, then making counter narratives and conflicting narratives, and make the voice of the victims make public. So I agree with your argument generally. Then in our context, under the still Cold War in East Asia, so overcoming the Cold War culture and Cold War state monopoly of violence and knowledge must be initiated from now on, I think.
I think we can open it up for questions now, and Ms. Young has a mic if it's needed. And I think that both Professor Lloyd and Professor Kim will be open to continuing the conversation right now. So anyone in particular who...
You talked about something like... Oh, sure. You talked... Yes. Professor Kim, you talked about 10,000 petitions. I assume the number of victims was orders of magnitude larger than that of injustice. Did the petitions generally, were they on behalf of multiple victims typically?
Yeah. The petitions, the victims' families and third-world spectators can apply to our commission. But unfortunately, we could receive the petition only 1 year. So some of the petitions we dismissed because the deaths were caused by incident and occasional incident under the bombing, and when we call collateral damage cases, we can say. So I think less than 10% of the victims didn't apply to us. Didn't or couldn't. Didn't, I mean they don't like to look at the past anymore by their family members. I don't like to think about my parents' past anymore. And some of them couldn't because the very fact of establish our commission didn't publicize broadly among Koreans.
Because I assume the number of victims was on the order of hundreds of thousands. Yeah.
Thank you for both professors for a presentation. My question had to do with to Professor Kim about the in your chart you showed of your petitions you had a result of you mentioned about 75% achievement. Now these commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in different countries or different incidences have had different sorts of results. In some cases, there was no criminal proceedings against the people who were doing it. In other cases, they're very aggressive in trying to see